Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. It's pretty exciting to be at our that's kind of hard to believe, sixth annual SU Research Day. This is where we come together and highlight some of our outstanding faculty and their scholarly activities. So it's meant to be celebratory in nature and also meant to be academic in nature. And so we appreciate all of you being here, students, staff, faculty, everyone. It's a great time to kind of celebrate what we do outside of the classroom, as well as the activities that we do that support our faculty and staff and their scholarly activities. For those of you that don't know the voice or the face, I'm Clifton Griffin, Dean of Grad Studies and Research here at SU. Lots of folks in our office have been a part of the logistics of setting this up, so I'm very appreciative of the staff of Grad Studies and Research for all of their activities today and the last few days to get us started. I do want to say thank you to our president, Dr. Chuck White, for making it. I know he's rushed here from a Board of Regents, a thrilling Board of Regents experience, and so we appreciate you being here, Chuck. Thank you very much. Also want to say a big shout out and thanks and appreciation for our interim provost and senior vice president, Dr. Karen Olmstead, huge advocate and supporter of research at all levels, from faculty to grad students to undergraduates. So thank you all for being here for sure. So to keep us on time, I'm going to hush, which is the hardest thing I ever do, and we'll get started with our first presentation from the Purdue School of Business, Department of Management and Marketing. Dr. Stephen Adams is going to talk with us about Before the Garage, the beginnings of Silicon Valley. Dr. Adams.
Thank you, Clifton, and thank you all for coming. What I'd like to start with is a little geography, right? Silicon Valley, where is it? And as you can see, we're in California. San Francisco is the top of the peninsula there. And the dark region that you can see is Santa Clara County, which is where most of the tech action is, but the county north of it, San Mateo, is also a big part of the story. And here's the same region with some companies. Now, some you can't see. The San Francisco there at the top, of course, has Twitter and Airbnb and Uber, among other things. But you can see some of the other things that make your life what it is, right? YouTube, Facebook, Google, Apple down there at the bottom, and HP is in there along with Stanford University, and that's sort of central to the story I'm going to tell. So, greatest legal accumulation of wealth the world has ever seen. Not my words, but some people truly believe that, and who's going to argue? You've got not just those firms I showed you, but there are more than 10,000 tech firms in that area, employing more than 500,000 tech people. And actually, I was really interested. There was a survey done by Stanford of their alumni that indicated if you took the companies started by Stanford alumni and treated them like a country, the GDP of that country would put them as the 10th largest economy in the world. So this is a big, big deal. So naturally, it's influential. There are a lot of Silicon Valley wannabes. There's aspirations associated with the Silicon Valley phenomenon. And you can see all these names. I'm not going to read them to you. I don't even know where some of these places are, Silicon Valley Cape, for instance. But anyway, you get the idea. I'm trained as a historian. So, a lot of these wannabes are looking for a magic formula. If you just have A, B, and C, then you can have the next Silicon Valley. I am actually more interested in process and antecedents as a historian. So my project begins in 1909. The first major tech company, FTC, was the Federal Telegraph Company, which, as you can imagine, was telecommunications. But my period ends in 1959, and some of you probably didn't even realize Silicon Valley existed in 1959. But already there were more than 100 companies. Already there had, just recently in 59 and 60, there were visits from the head of the Soviet Union and the president of France. And so this was a big deal then. And so I'm going to talk about the national, state, and local factors involved in making Silicon Valley what it is today, and using Hewlett-Packard as an example. Talking garages, right? Let's talk some garages we know, like Google. They're on the right, Menlo Park. So 1998, what happened in that garage? Well, as you guys probably know, Brin and Page developed their algorithm at Stanford University. And when they moved to this garage, they did not bring their servers with them. All they used the garage for was administration, and they were only there for 3 months, so not a big deal. The Apple garage on the left there, and you can see that person casting a big shadow, I bet you can guess who that is. That's Steve Jobs. So what happened in the Apple garage in 1976? Well, Steve Wozniak, who was the technological brains behind Apple, was an employee of Hewlett-Packard at the time, and Steve Jobs was working for Atari. So the Apple I computer, the first product, was actually developed not in this garage, but at Hewlett-Packard during off hours by Steve Wozniak. So you can actually say that Apple was an HP spin-off. So you're probably wondering, okay, here's the HP garage. 1938, you're probably thinking, well, did anything happen in there? And there's actually a plaque out there that says, the birthplace of Silicon Valley, so it darn well better be important. Hold that thought. Let's have a little entrepreneurship lesson. What does a startup need? I mean, I know you guys have probably all watched Shark Tank, and certainly you see people march out there with a gizmo and maybe with a team. And so if you're talking about a tech region like Silicon Valley, you probably need the Wozniak or the Brin and Page, someone who really knows the technology. So team, know-how, and of course that leads to universities. Customers, as a startup, you really don't have a going concern until someone is willing to pony up for your product or service. And then finally, resources. There's a good reason why there's a lot of venture capital in Silicon Valley. People need the money to get the business going. And not just, that's not the only resource. There are human resources, and then there's institutions that can help in the development of a firm. So let's look big picture. And if I was going to say, if there's one slide or lesson that I want you to take away from my talk today, this is the one. I think that the most important thing in the development of Silicon Valley was the fact that it was born in the United States in the 20th century. And there are 3 reasons for that. One, I mentioned Stanford, and the United States had the foremost collection of research universities in the world by 1940. Also, in terms of customers, military. There's nothing like having a customer that is price insensitive and willing to experiment with you. And certainly by 1940, when the United States was mobilizing for World War II, that was available for startups. And then by 1920, the US was the richest economy in the world. So essentially, by 1940, the stage is set for this. So let's get back to Hewlett-Packard, right? There's Stanford campus, and sure enough, William Hewlett was on campus in the laboratory between May and July of 1938. They didn't move into the garage until September. He develops their first product from May to July. He takes it up to Portland, Oregon for the Institute of Radio Engineers conference in August, demonstrates it, and essentially meets all the requirements for patenting by August of 1938 before they move into the garage. So, Stanford. Stanford was not just any university at the time. It's nice that the United States had this great university system. Stanford had the top endowment among universities in America by 1899, and it wasn't even 10 years old. 1900, one of the 12 charter members of this collection of research universities, and by 1927, crucial to our story, one of the top 3 electrical engineering programs in the United States, which produced these guys, Hewlett and Packard. They met at Stanford. They were mentored by a fellow named Frederick Terman, an electrical engineering professor who later became known as the father of Silicon Valley. So, they lined up within, by 1940, they had, by the way, this is the Pentagon. It wasn't built until 1942, but you get the idea. By 1940, they had lined up defense contracts and subcontracts. And let me tell you why that's so important. There's an expression for you, liability of newness. half of all startups fail within 5 years or less. So, but once, if a company makes it through the first 5 years successfully, then the failure rates during the next 5 years fall dramatically. So whatever a firm can do during those first 5 years to survive, and those first 5 years are often called the valley of death, one of the things you can do is get a great customer, a reliable source of revenue, and HP did that with their price-insensitive lead user, the U.S. Signal Corps, part of the Army. What doing that allows you to do during your first 5 years is to build an organization. And entrepreneurship lesson number 2, what entrepreneurs really build is not just the gizmos you see on Shark Tank. It's an organization that will build product after service. And that's what HP was able to do. And in fact, in this case, the organization building, it's a twofer, because while David Packard was home running the organization in Palo Alto during the war, William Hewlett was actually in the Army, serving in the Signal Corps. And as part of his job, he was going from laboratory to laboratory throughout the country. And that came in handy after the war, because he'd been sizing people up, making contacts. And what do you think HP did when the war ended? They recruited these people. And so that became part of their competitive advantage. Money. Where did HP get their money in the first place? Well, the old friends, family, and fools, right? Well, family mattered. Packard chose his parents well. And so his parents loaned the company thousands of dollars during the early 40s. Then, when the family wasn't able to meet their requirements, Packard goes to the local bank, the Palo Alto National Bank, where the manager remembered him as a Stanford football hero. It's almost like out of a movie, and so he gives him this loan. That was a small bank, though, and Hewlett-Packard was going to grow a lot, and ultimately their bank was the Anglo-California Bank, a very big bank, more than 10 times larger than the Palo Alto National Bank. But where are they located? That dark region I showed you, south of San Francisco, Santa Clara County, it was called, at the time, the Valley of Heart's Delight. It was an agricultural region, mainly apricots. This makes it look like it was cherries. But anyway, the point is, there's not a bank in sight, is there? And so how could this happen? And the answer is up the road. An hour up the road is San Francisco. And San Francisco was essentially a beneficiary of the gold rush. The gold rush makes California what it became, a state of the Union. And the money from gold and from copper and from silver, all these Western mining extravaganzas, ends up flowing through what was the foremost financial capital west of the Mississippi. So San Francisco was a big, big financial deal in the West. And furthermore, as we're talking about Palo Alto, which is an hour south of San Francisco, having a bank like the Palo Alto National Bank, and by the way, they were acquired by the Anglo-California Bank, the San Francisco Bank. They became a branch of the Anglo-California Bank. And branch banking was something that was pioneered in the United States by California. California was the leading branch bank state by 1930. And so all these major Silicon Valley companies, starting with HP and leading up to the end of my period, 1959, they were operating on the peninsula in these towns with banks that were branches of banks that were headquartered in San Francisco. This allowed for the suburbanization of technology in San Francisco, or in California, specifically Silicon Valley. The final thing related to financing, again, 1940, as part of the defense mobilization, Franklin Roosevelt thinks, gosh, there's got to be a way to motivate startups and small business to become part of the mobilization. And knowing that banks, commercial banks being conservative, as commercial banks will be, they like collateral. And the ingenious idea was, well, gee, what if government contracts could be used as collateral for loans? And that's what the Assignment of Claims Act of 1940 allowed. And every single major company that I looked at, with one exception, took advantage, including HP. So back to our little map, you can see at the very top of the dark region is Palo Alto, where Stanford and HP are, and they were really the southernmost of these tech companies during the period, major tech companies in the period from 1940 to 59. All the others were in the lighter region up north, closer to San Francisco, and so an hour was the longest it would take any of these firms to go meet with their banker. Those closer to San Francisco took, not just their banker, the headquarters of the bank in which they were working with the branch. But also, San Francisco was important for something else: law. There were a lot of lawyers in San Francisco, including key patent attorneys. And as you might know, one of the key things, if you're involved in tech, you gotta be able to protect your intellectual property. So patent attorneys are super important to this. Now, how did San Francisco end up with legal capabilities before electronics was such a big deal? And the answer actually is in that image you saw of the Valley of Heart's Delight. It came from agriculture and it came from mining, extractive industry. It turns out California was so removed from the makers of the big machinery that you needed in agriculture and mining, and those companies were in the Midwest or the West or the East, 1,000, maybe 2,000 miles away. It cost a fortune to ship this equipment, so Californians innovated. They made their own. And as a result, before the electronics revolution, in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, California has more patents per capita than any state in the country, with one exception, Connecticut. So it's an innovative region even before our story begins. So, and then specifically HP and their relationship to law. Again, Packard chose his parents well. What do you think Sperry Packard did for a living? He was a lawyer. But the bad news is he was based in Pueblo, Colorado. And so when 1939, when Packard contacts his dad and asks for legal advice, his dad writes back and says, "I'll give you one piece of advice. Find a San Francisco lawyer." And that leads into Hewlett, who chose his wife well. The San Francisco firm Byrne, Lamson, and Jordan, which ended up doing the partnership agreements for HP in the 40s, Lamson was Cora Lamson's father, so Hewlett's father-in-law. And now they didn't do patent law, so they referred Hewlett-Packard to a guy named Paul Flair. And so within 2 days of Sperry Packard's response to David Packard saying, "I'm not going to work with you," Paul Flair is in correspondence with William Hewlett about patent stuff. And I think it's a safe bet that Cora Lamson's dad made that possible. So Paul Flair, interesting guy. He had been involved in patents for agriculture and for extractive industry, and he made the transition from one industry, from one industrial revolution to the next. And so if you look at, and here are the Fab Five of Silicon Valley in the 1950s. 4 of these companies went public in the 50s. Only Litton Industries didn't because they got acquired by somebody. And 4 of these 5 companies, Hewlett-Packard, Ampex, Litton, and Varian, all worked with Paul Flair. And stepping back a bit, looking at the question, great story about Hewlett and Packard, how representative of the Silicon Valley story is it? Well, since these are the biggest 5 companies of the Valley in the 1950s, they all essentially had the same story, or very similar, with respect to customer. Federal government either was in at the beginning, like with Ampex, Litton, and Varian, or very soon, like HP and ITEL McCulloch. In terms of working with Stanford University, all of them did so with the possible exception of ITEL McCulloch. And then in terms of whether they used government contracts as collateral for loans in a big way, all of them did, except Ampex may have, but I haven't found any evidence for it yet. So in conclusion, the big point about Silicon Valley was born in the right place, in the right country, the right state, at the right time. And during its first 50 years, ending in 1959, innovation was made possible by inheritance of resources, of institutions, and of laws. And so these garages, like the HP garage, they look pretty humble, and you think, oh gosh, maybe a rags to riches story here. But no, the garages may have been humble, but the beginnings of Silicon Valley were not. So with that, what questions do you have? And we've got, what, 8 minutes? While you're thinking of questions, let me point out something. I brought this up, product from the Valley, my Apple iPhone, and I don't know if you heard, but the archives of HP burned last fall up in Santa Rosa. All the early papers, I mentioned the correspondence with Packard and his father, burned up. Fortunately, I'd been there in 2015, and there are hundreds of documents on this phone that I took. Historians have become photographers, right? So anyway, what questions have you got? Yes?
I'm curious, there's a lot that's written in sort of mythos about Silicon Valley, and I'm curious about how does your research confirm or maybe challenge some of the stories that were told in the mythology about Silicon Valley?
Okay. Well, in terms of the stuff that you would go down and see at Barnes & Noble, most of that stuff on Silicon Valley is individual focused. And so I can almost imagine the first sentence of almost all those books. It says, it all started with, and then you can fill in the blank. That guy, Frederick Terman, the father of Silicon Valley, who mentored Hewlett and Packard, one possibility. William Shockley, the guy who headed the team that invented the transistor and then brought semiconductors to the Valley, another possibility. More recently, Jobs is another candidate. He's so visible, and yet I would say I don't think there is one person. This was an institutional and a sort of evolutionary story, and a lot of people play big roles, but it's not one garage, one person that begins and gets credit for the whole phenomenon. Thanks, Emily. All right, Rich.
There are a lot of places that want to be Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
Do any of the lessons about historic history of Silicon Valley provide any lessons for today, or is that really a snapshot of time and circumstances?
That's a great question. I think the first thing that these other places really need to acknowledge is how long this process took. If the first major tech company was 1909, and the name Silicon Valley didn't arrive until 1971. Silicon Valley became the top tech region in the United States sometime in the late 1970s, surpassing Route 128 in Boston. So that's one thing. But another thing is I was in a debate at Stanford University where I was given what seemed to be a really easy, it was an Oxford-style debate, you wear robes and all this real formal thing. And so I was given the proposition to defend that, the Stanford Silicon Valley could be a useful model to follow, which leads directly to your question. And wouldn't you know, I lost that debate. And one of my opponent was very good. But people in those, it was a thing where after the debate, people in the room voted. Well, the people in the room were from South America and Europe, and frankly, were tired of being told, well, gee, why don't you do this? And they didn't do this because they didn't have a lot of these advantages that I just mentioned. And so the idea that these other places, all you need to do is get yourself, I heard a venture capitalist say, if you want to do this, just set up a Stanford-type university, Malaysia, wherever you want to be, and you too can do this. No, that's not the way it works. So that's the advice I'd give these people. Karen.
So there's another big campus in that general area.
Yes.
Right? I wonder if you could just give us a snapshot of what was going on at Berkeley that was a little bit different.
UC Berkeley. Well, actually, Berkeley, I didn't mention Berkeley, and that's no offense to Berkeley. In fact, my wife is an alum, so I actually, yeah. But actually, Berkeley was a major differentiator. the San Francisco Bay Area is the only tech region in the country that really essentially has two of the top engineering programs in close proximity. So that, MIT is great, but there's not UC Berkeley to complement it. And so Berkeley's contributions to Silicon Valley came in a variety of ways. One was in terms of computing. They had computer science long before Stanford did, and IBM sets up shop in the southern part of the valley, and they used a lot of Cal alums and professors to do so. Also, Cal was where, I mentioned legal talent. That's where a lot of these legal folks came from. They came from the law school at Cal, including Larry Sonsini, who is the top lawyer in the valley. So I could go on, but Cal has been huge in this development. They just happen to be on the other side of the bay.
But in terms of philanthropic outreach and kind of returning that money to the campuses, have you found they had different approaches?
Oh, okay. Well, let's put it this way. Stanford was a net importer of philanthropy. Foundation money helped Stanford become what it is. But their model as an independent private university was never really about developing the region. Even they talked about it a lot, but they never did anything that I've been able to see that went against the interests of the institution. Whereas UC Berkeley, the public institution, did. They were more, I would say, community-minded about the state of California. And so as a result, they were more, the engineering school at Berkeley was more focused on what they could do for the state. Civil engineering, the dams and so on, were a bigger deal to them, whereas at Stanford, the engineering focus was more on, well, what can these individuals do, whether it's in mining or in electrical engineering.
In the essence of time, let's maybe move on. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of our faculty presenters. We certainly appreciate your energy. This brings us to the end of our faculty presentation part of the SU Research Day. We encourage you to stick around, have some refreshments, and visit with the folks that are in the back. Once again, thank you to all of our faculty. Let's give them another round of applause. Fascinating array of scholarship that we heard about this afternoon, and it always is really a great opportunity to hear from our faculty. Thank you so much.